Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Fike, and this is a brief talk on some aspects of the Euthyphro, which we are studying. The Euthyphro is a dialogue written by Plato. It's a conversation that takes place between Socrates and Euthyphro. Euthyphro is an individual who prides himself upon his expertise with respect to religiosity, and in particular the quality of piety, or what we would translate roughly today as moral uprightness with respect to one's moral duty. So, or religious duties, I should say. So it's being a good person from a religious perspective. So it does have some currency, even though the word is rather antiquated. So as you can see here, what I've done is I've gone into the Euthyphro from your unit, and I can minimize that view, and then by clicking on the camera image, I can actually open up the document. Makes it easy for reference. I can enlarge this a little bit, and I'm not going to say a lot here, but one thing that's very clear and that I hope you pick up on right away is that when Plato writes, using Socrates as his mouthpiece, he is very interested in honing in on issues of great importance. And what I mean by that is that clearly the stakes are matters of life and death when it comes to the fruitfulness or lack of fruitfulness that transpires in the dialogue or conversation that takes place between Socrates and Euthyphro. I should mention that there's no substitute for reading the text. So my suggestion here is that if you haven't done so already, you read pages 1 through 8 of the Euthyphro, or better yet, just read through the entirety of the Euthyphro and then come back and listen to my brief comments on it. So it's important to notice, for example, that at the outset of the Euthyphro, the meeting takes place on a court porch. And the significance of that, one significant aspect of that is that it takes place on the porch of the King Archon, who was essentially a religious figure. And that is one way of bringing out the fact that in ancient Greece, there was no division between civil authority and religious authority. In more plain English, to commit a crime against the state was also to violate religion. There was no separation between church and state. It's fortuitous, Socrates says, that Euthyphro is an expert on religious matters because Socrates himself has been accused of being guilty of a religious infraction that may carry with it the penalty of death. And so, again, I want to stress that Plato is accentuating or accenting the fact that the issue is not a trivial one, and that insofar as philosophy plays a role in the deliberations between Euthyphro and Socrates, the outcome could, in fact, cost somebody their life. Now, if you read the beginning of the Euthyphro, you discover that Euthyphro is there to bring charges against his father, and that Miletus has brought charges already against Socrates. So I encourage you to look carefully at the circumstances under which each are described as having been brought to this place in their life. We will learn more about the factors that have resulted in Socrates being brought there when we move on to the Apology, most certainly. But it's interesting and worthy of note that in the case of Euthyphro, some of the details are laid out by him, and they are significant enough that Socrates is shocked by the confidence with which Euthyphro goes about levying this claim against his own father. And so one can ask whether or not Euthyphro himself is placing some kind of religious principle of religious insight above more mundanely human concerns. That is to say, everyday matters that ought to constrain one in making authoritative judgments about issues that can affect the life and death, in this case of one's family member. So I'm going to leave it to you to look carefully and take seriously what it is that Euthyphro says about the circumstances that have convinced him that he has no choice but to bring his father to trial for impiety. What we're concerned with in terms of the philosophical content really begins, as I scroll down, it really begins on page 4, not to skip pages 1 through 3, but moving on to page 4, you'll see that finally Socrates, who is confronted with this situation in which he may in fact lose his life because he's been charged with impiety, says at last to Euthyphro, and what is piety and what is impiety? And Euthyphro responds thus. He says, piety is doing as I am doing. That is to say, prosecuting anyone who is guilty of murder, sacrilege, or any similar crime, whether he be your father or mother, or whether he may be or whoever he may be, that makes no difference, and not to prosecute them is impiety. And for those of you who have read this, or if you want to pause and read it now, what eventually Socrates says to him is, I did not ask you, now I'm on page 5 of your reading, I did not ask you to give me an example of piety, but rather I asked you to tell me what piety is so that I could use that definition as a standard. And really what we have here is we have Plato using Socrates to help us see the importance of analytical definitions. Now, if you go to my website at www.larryfike.net, or also trace, if you're doing this within Canvas, you can also find a link there on definition types. You can see that I've presented 4 different types of definitions, and the first type of definition that is being offered by Euthyphro is in fact an ostensive definition. A definition by example is an ostensive definition, and its inadequacy is due to the fact that there may be some feature of the example that either is not noticed by the person who is being given the definition that is relevant, or there may be some condition that exempts that definition from being applicable in the given circumstances. An example of this that I sometimes give is the example of a fictitious character who we'll call Xylo, and Xylo doesn't know what a cup is, and so consequently we give him an example of a red cup. I don't happen to have a cup with me now, and I'm not going to worry about that. Let me use a different example, see if I can do it this way. Here's a folder, let's say, right? And because Xylo doesn't know what a folder is, and then the next day, let's say that Xylo comes up to me and he says, oh, thank you for teaching me what a folder is. I now have a folder. And then I say to Xylo, that's not a folder. This is another folder. And he says, no, it's not, but this is. Well, it's clear what's happening, right? In my example, this folder may have prompted Xylo to focus on the wrong characteristic of it, in virtue of which it is a folder, namely the green color. And so Xylo goes out and he thinks that this is a folder, and he rejects the idea that this is a folder, even though it is a kind of folder. So what happens with ostensive definitions more generally is that they always run the possibility of letting in things that don't belong within the definiendum, or the term that we're trying to define, and or they keep out things that do belong within the definiendum class. So let's see. In the case of saying that piety is what I am doing now, the problem that Socrates sees is that there are things which constitute pious behavior which are not actions of prosecuting a wrongdoer at all. Imagine a clear-cut case like giving food to a person who is hungry with nobody else coming into the knowledge of the fact that you were the one who gave them the food. In such a case, surely the action would be pious, and yet it would not be a case of prosecuting a wrongdoer. What this shows is that the condition laid down for piety by Euthyphro is not a necessary condition. It's not necessary that I prosecute a wrongdoer in order to be performing a pious act. However, we can also see that prosecuting a wrongdoer for a crime that they genuinely performed may also not be sufficient for the action to be a pious action. You can imagine, for example, that a hitman is giving up another hitman for the wrongdoing of having murdered somebody, and in that case, he would be doing the very same sort of thing that Euthyphro recommends you do if you're pious, namely prosecuting a wrongdoer for murder, theft, sacrilege, or any similar crime. And yet we would never say that the hitman, who is presumably only giving up another hitman because he wants to reduce his own sentence, is doing something pious. And so in this case, we see that it's not sufficient to say, to use an example of what piety is in order to understand what piety itself is. So, ostensive definitions more generally fail to state the necessary or the sufficient conditions of the definiendum or the term that we want to define. On the other hand, it is, in fact, an analytical definition that accomplishes just that task. And so it is, we discover, analytical definitions that are primarily prized by philosophers. Now, there are many more things that I could say. For example, the next proposed definition of piety that Euthyphro offers is that piety is what I am doing now, that piety is what the gods love, and impiety is what the gods hate. And that definition is found on page 5. Here it is, in fact. Let's see. Piety, then, is that which is dear to the gods, and impiety is that which is not dear to them. And then Socrates says, you have given me the sort of definition which I wanted. However, what we will find is that there is an inadequacy with this proposed definition as well. And we can actually show that by means of writing up arguments, and I have actually given you those arguments in another unit, and if necessary, I may come back and do another recording in which I explain the significance of those arguments. However, I would like for you to work through them and see if you can determine the way in which the second proposed definition of piety also is found to be wanting by Euthyphro, and then to go on to proposed definition number 3, see what is problematic about that. And much of this is done in the units, although I may at some point come on and video a commentary on those arguments as well, especially if I receive a request to do so. Thank you very much, and I do hope that this short video helps you in appreciating philosophy, its seriousness, and the examples of Socrates and Plato, and even that of Euthyphro.